The outgoing Minister for Transport, Sindisiwe Chikunga, has held an event today. She says to mark 30 years of progress in improving transport systems around the country. She's also reiterated that an integrated transport model is needed. Last week, the President signed into law the new National Land Transport Act. Under the Act, e-hailing drivers will be regulated as normal transport operators. They will have to apply for licenses. There's been a bit of a regulatory black hole around this issue for some time. Rebecca Phala is the national spokesperson for the South African National Taxi Council, the running minibus taxis, of course. Rebecca, good afternoon to you. From what I understand, this new law means that e-hailing drivers will now have to apply for licenses. Do you welcome that? In the past, they've had to apply from different authorities. Do you think government is now moving in the right direction on this?
Hi, Stephen. Absolutely. Look, we were all just operating on a daily basis. You've rightly said, when they started, most of them were operating. Some were using meter taxi operating licenses. Some of them were just getting authorized for having driver's licenses and PRDPs, and they would begin to operate. Essentially, it led to a lot of confusion on the ground. And so it's a step in the right direction, really. We do welcome it quite well, yes.
Do you think it's going to affect at all the number of e-hailing drivers on the road? I mean, around the world, we've seen a sort of explosion e-hailing drivers. I think we see it in our cities as well. Do you think it's going to affect the number of people who are driving for Bolt and Uber and other services?
It certainly will. In fact, a great number of why we continue to hear of people feeling like their lives are in danger, in some instances, people being violated whilst using these modes of transport, in particular e-hailing vehicles. It's been found in many cases that the people who are driving these vehicles, the registrations that had been registered with the relevant companies were not the same as the person that's been driving. We are expecting that there will be a considerable reduction in terms of the number of people who will operate, because we're hoping that as soon as the National Department of Transport releases the regulations to that particular regard, there'll be clarity in terms of who qualifies to be an e-hailing operator. And one of the biggest issues really is we want for, as they continue to issue these licenses from provincial regulatory entities, that they look at the demand on the ground so that we don't find ourselves in a situation where there's an oversupply of public transport and the demand is something else.
Some of your drivers will be part of this. You have the Shisha app, if I remember correctly. You're one of the partners in that. I mean, it's early days. You've only been going for about 6 weeks. Are you finding that there's a lot of interest in that?
There's quite a lot of interest, Stephen. I think you would know there's been also a considerable sort of consensus on the ground. A lot of people have been saying most of these popular foreign-owned apps have been problematic in many ways when you look at the number of hours that one has to work and the amount of money that they make in comparison to that. And so one of the reasons why we're seeing so much of an uptake is, one, it comes with the sense of comfort, especially for commuters, to say if you are in a locally developed app, you should be able to get some accountability if you encounter challenges. But secondly, the issues of how much money they're able to make on these platforms in comparison to these foreign-owned apps where a huge chunk of what they're making goes out. There's going to be a considerable reduction in that regard. So we have been seeing a lot of them. In fact, with Shesha and the other apps, there's also Taxi Ride, Shuma and U-Taxi. A lot of them have been doing a lot of training for drivers who seem to be keen to do something with a locally produced app with hope that they'll be treated better and make an honest living.
Rebecca, in the past, your members appear to have blocked e-hailing drivers from using certain routes. And minibus taxi drivers have claimed they don't have proper licenses. In some cases, people haven't been able to, go and fetch, Uber drivers haven't been able to go and fetch people who've been shopping at certain shopping malls. Now that this whole licensing thing is being sorted out, will you, as the taxi industry as Santaco, accept that? And will you allow them to carry on their businesses just like they allow you to carry out your business? You seem to have lost your sound there, Rebecca. Can you hear us?
In regards to how some of these operators were really finding themselves on the roads, that there was this ambiguity in terms of the operations of e-hailing operators to say, who are they, what documentation do they have? The question of jurisdiction was largely overlooked. So what we're going to do, and the reason why we're emphasizing to say government should speedily release those regulations, is so that through our internal proceedings, we can then start engaging our drivers, we can start engaging everyone that works, especially on the ground, so they understand to say this new player that's now been legalized, What does it mean in terms of the way in which they will be coming in? You'd know at some point we didn't have BRT buses, for example, but the manner in which they were introduced was such that as one of the big stakeholders in the terms of road-based public transport, we were consulted. We actively are involved in some of the operations. And as a result, you don't often find a lot of hiccups in that particular regard. So we're waiting for the clarity that will come with the regulations so that it can be cascaded down properly. And that way, our members will know who in the greater and integrated public transport network are they working with. It was always very unfortunate that it has led to violence. It has largely been because the big issue of consultation was always overlooked, and we don't really know why that was the case. It's very regrettable.
Well, Rebecca, you say it's unfortunate that there was violence. I'm not aware of any case in which an e-hailing driver attacked a minibus taxi driver. It was always minibus taxi drivers attacking e-hailing drivers.
I don't know if you also have actual concrete evidence that supports that assertion, Stephen, to say that it was minibus drivers who did that. It is this common misconception and narrative that's always making prominence, even as perpetuated by yourselves, colleagues in the Fourth Estate, to say the taxi industry, the minibus taxi industry in particular, becomes suspect number one. And yet we still don't have one case that police have said we've opened against a particular operator or a particular driver. They've gone to court because of this suspected violence. And that is very unfortunate. There has always been a lot of hiccups on the ground between either of the parties. It's unfortunate to want to narrow it down to one party. It's very unfortunate.
Oh, come on, Rebecca, please. We all know, we all see it. We all know what happens. You can claim that it's not true. But so many people have so many stories of your members of your industry taking the law into their own hands. Come on, Rebecca, don't deny it.
We can't just be making statements like that. We can't be making statements like that. Okay. There is violence, there is criminality that has infiltrated public transport network, especially at the level of road-based transport, solely because of that very reason. There's this ambiguity, and we are saying to you, once there's clarity, we're hoping that this criminality will be reduced. We've never taken accountability for any of those acts because it has never been proven that it is our operators. So this narrative that you have of always having us as suspect number one is very unfortunate, Stephen, because you can't just throw in statements of saying, we know this, it happens. But where is the evidence? For as long as you can't show me one person who is a true taxi operator who was seen doing this, unfortunately, it's your word against mine, and you can't dismiss mine. You just can't.
Rebecca, there was a time, a couple of years ago, in Soweto where the e-hailing taxis basically eventually had to avoid going to shopping malls. In fact, if I remember correctly, the taxi industry, the minibus taxi industry, allowed them to drop off people with disabilities at shopping malls. This was part of an agreement. The Gauteng provincial government was part of it, Rebecca. You'll remember that case very well.
Oh, I do. In fact, I was one of the people that were part of those deliberations. And what you saw there was all the parties coming together to say, in the interim, because at the time, one, operations of e-hailing were not legalized, so these people were operating without permits. But secondly, there was no clarity in terms of how are they supposed to work, because in the status quo at the time, you had taxis, minibuses in particular, operating from taxi ranks. You have meter taxis operating shortly just around the taxi ranks in accordance with meters, and buses operating in their manner. What we saw there was a sense of patriotism where all role players saw that there's a big problem and they decided, let's sit down and find an agreement. Not once during those proceedings did any of the partners, inclusive of minibus taxi operators, not once did one of them claim responsibility. If anything, there was a genuine concern to say there's been an infiltration of criminality into the work that we do. You would even remember, you may have spoken to the MMC of Transport at the time, Kenny Kunene, who was making reference and even saying there is a Nguni term that they use to say there are these people who are not supposed licensed to be operating these services,
Rebecca,
who are just taking people without operation.
This outbreak of cooperation came after three e-hailing cars were set alight, one Bolt driver was shot at. I mean, that's what happened. Now, who did that?
That is true. I know that very well, Stephen, but what I'm saying to you is when, during those proceedings, in fact, if you would remember, I spoke to you on the other platform, and I even said to you, the leadership of the taxi industry is willing to cooperate with police to help them find this, because we don't take pride in being labeled suspect number one as and when these incidents are taking place. We don't take responsibility for any of them. To this day, even after that agreement was reached, Stephen, at which time those people who were operating illegally were essentially checked out because all role players who are licensed to be operating agreed. There has never been such similar incidents. So I'm saying to you, you are missing the point. The bigger problem here is that there's criminality which sees loopholes where there's no proper regulation on road-based transport, and it leads us to there being violence, which is very regrettable.
Rebecca Phala, thank you. National spokesperson for the South African National Taxi Council. Do appreciate it. More in sport with Hugo in a moment.